Presented by AT&T.
I want to be very clear up front. It should not have been this way.
Now, the effort to get Americans out of Afghanistan is gaining momentum. Sources tell CNN the U.S. is completely now pulling out of the embassy in Kabul.
You have helicopters moving personnel from the mission to the airport, which is against what President Joe Biden said would happen.
What you're looking at is video, CNN's shot of some of the helicopters that are shuttling employees from the embassy.
The withdrawal decision is completely defensible by the Biden administration. The implementation and the handling is what's been lacking. And I'm hearing this from U.S. officials, from activists, from Afghans themselves.
I'm Jeremy Siegel. This is Politico Dispatch. And today,
I'm Alex Ward. I'm a national security reporter at Politico and also the anchor of our National Security Daily newsletter.
Alex Ward on the fall of Kabul. Alex, we are less than a month away from the date when President Biden said all U.S. troops would be withdrawn from Afghanistan. At this point, the Taliban has essentially completed a sweep of the country. Kabul, the capital, has fallen. How did we get to where we are today?
Well, we have to go back even before the Biden administration, right? So you have President Donald Trump make a deal with the Taliban in which he said the U.S. wants to leave.
I'll be meeting personally with Taliban leaders in the not too distant future. And we'll be very much hoping that they will be doing what they say they're going to be doing. They will be killing terrorists.
And we will leave by May 1st if all conditions are met.
We've had tremendous success in Afghanistan in the killing of terrorists, but it's time, after all these years, to go and to bring our people back home. We want to bring our people back home. And again, it's been...
The plan has long been in together, out together.
Then President Biden came into office and he said a few months later after he entered the White House, he said, I want out under no conditions.
U.S. troops as well as forces deployed by our NATO allies and operational partners will be out of Afghanistan before we mark the 20th anniversary of that heinous attack on September 11th.
Basically meaning that it didn't really matter what the Taliban was doing, the U.S. was going to leave, and he picked September 11th as a withdrawal date. The Taliban took advantage of that moment and they encircled tons of urban areas and positioned fighters elsewhere. And it looked like they were ready for, whenever they were going to launch it, an all-out assault around the country.
The Afghan army is quickly losing ground throughout the country to the Taliban. Now, to bolster its flagging military, the government is arming militias to help in the fight.
And that, by the way, it should be said, this was the expectation. The expectation was that if the U.S. left Afghanistan and foreign troops also left, that the Taliban would do a takeover, right? This isn't the surprising part. The surprising part is the speed. And that's what's caught everyone off guard. They started by taking a provincial capital of Zaranj just over a week ago.
Right, the Taliban have captured the capital of Afghanistan's Nimruz province as they step up their offensive across the country. Earlier in the day, gunmen shot and killed the head of the Afghan government's media and information center.
And really, they've taken almost every provincial capital since, with Kabul really the last main one to fall.
As the situation on the ground in Kabul rapidly deteriorates, U.S. forces there are rushing to evacuate all personnel from the embassy.
There are images online coming out right now inside Kabul, the presidential palace overrun by the Taliban. As you noted, U.S. officials have confirmed to Fox News that Afghan President Ashraf Ghani fled the country.
So at this point, you've basically seen a complete collapse of the Afghan military, of Afghan authority, in just over a week or so.
The blistering Taliban gains have reportedly taken some U.S. officials by surprise. But many this week, including President Biden, have kept the focus on the Afghan government's need to defend itself.
They've got to fight for themselves.
It has simply stunned everyone in the U.S. and around the world, and it is arguably already one of the most successful guerrilla and insurgent campaigns in history. I mean, think about it. You have a militant group that in a matter of, days, not only looks like it's going to depose a government, but a government backed by a major foreign power. It's quite stunning.
How was the Taliban able to do this so quickly? And how were U.S. officials caught by such surprise? Can blame be placed anywhere here?
This is a pretty big question here, and we should be honest, it's unclear. The current signs are this, though. One is everyone missed just how strong the Taliban were and how organized they were, and how much of the country didn't really want to fight for a quote unquote Afghan state. Mm-hmm. Two, the Afghan military that had been trained by the U.S. at the tune of billions of dollars and lives lost and over 20 years just wasn't up to the task, and simply did not want to fight tooth and nail for their country in multiple areas, and didn't really have the support that they needed when they were propped up by U.S. and NATO forces for years. That's not to say that there aren't valiant fighters in the Afghan military and people who are fighting for their homeland, but it just is not at the large enough scale to stop them. And the other is, it looks like shrewd planning by the Taliban, where they made political deals that it looks like had been talking to important members of Afghan society for a while, had a strong military campaign planned out. Mm-hmm. And I think fourth, you have to consider a lack of implementation and planning by the Biden administration. They decided to do the withdrawal in the middle of the fighting season, right? As opposed to when it's incredibly harsh conditions in Afghanistan and fighting usually winds down. The withdrawal during this time made it possible. There was a vacuum that the Taliban could fill when they would be fighting anyway, and when they usually, rack up the most casualties and do the most violence. So, the failure in Afghanistan has many parents, but what's led to this past week it seems to be sort of a combination of those four things. But, it'll take a lot of time to really dissect what we're witnessing.
Does this situation change the calculation for the Biden administration at all here?
It really doesn't look like it. I mean, President Biden has doubled down even with a statement on Saturday saying, even one more year or 5 more years wouldn't have changed the situation on the ground. He does not want to pass on American involvement in Afghanistan's war to another president. He's the fourth one to handle it. So it doesn't look like there's going to be a change in position as in the U.S. military is going to go back into the war and fight off the Taliban. It's a bit too late for that anyway.
Thinking back to how the U.S. entered Afghanistan at the start of this war 20 years ago, and how part of the goal of what the U.S. was doing there was to keep the Taliban at bay, and how now, 2 decades later, the Taliban has taken over the capital city. An emergency evacuation of the U.S. embassy, of U.S. officials there, was forced by this situation. I mean, I can't help but think of all of the people who are asking, what has been the point of any of this? How are you making sense of this moment?
I mean, it's such a massive question. Look, the U.S. military went into Afghanistan initially for a counterterrorism mission, which it did quite successfully. It's not Osama bin Laden is dead. Al-Qaeda is diminished in Afghanistan, but there are a bunch of terrorist groups still in the country, and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan still exists, even with an ISIS contingent. So, it's not like there isn't a terrorism concern in Afghanistan, and the U.S. military says it will continue to fight terrorists in Afghanistan, but basically through bombardments. But then it changed into turning Afghanistan into, a democratic nation with Western-style governance and values, and that's not to say that there were some people who were interested in that, right? Especially in Afghanistan. And there's no question that after 20 years, there were improvements in the lives of women and minorities and a bunch of people, but we failed to transfer our own sort of system of governance to that country. We failed in training a military that would defend such a government. We failed in transforming the society completely. We failed in keeping the Taliban at bay. And then we failed at really planning for the worst case situation when we decided to leave. It's we did it with good intentions, but as they say, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and we are at the last exit, it looks like, on the road to hell for the American mission, but that road to hell continues for the people of Afghanistan.
Alex, Ward, thanks so much for talking with me.
Thanks for having me.
Also, today, opponents of the federal government's pandemic-related eviction ban are asking a federal court to block the latest version of the policy, which the Biden administration rolled out under pressure after allowing an earlier version to expire. Landlords and 2 chapters of the National Association of Realtors asked the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals for, quote, immediate action to prevent enforcement of the moratorium issued by the CDC. The dispute, which seems certain to be resolved by the Supreme Court, looks likely to get a ruling from the D.C. Circuit by the end of the week. And the director of the National Institutes of Health is playing down undocumented immigrants as a major factor in the pandemic. Speaking to Fox News over the weekend, Francis Collins said it is an issue, but, quote, is certainly not the cause of our current dilemma. His comments come after Florida Governor Ron DeSantis recently blamed undocumented immigrants for a rise in COVID cases. Collins acknowledged the virus could inevitably spread among migrants, even with masking requirements that are in place, but emphasized that it's not the force behind the current rise in cases, and that U.S. leaders should focus on Americans who've refused to receive a vaccine. Today's episode of Politico Dispatch included music composed by Breakmaster Cylinder. If you like what you're hearing and want to help us out, tell a friend to check out the show. I'm Jeremy Siegel. Thanks for listening.
The Politico Dispatch podcast is sponsored by AT&T. Accessible, affordable broadband helps communities reach their American dream. For students like Susanna Chavez, it means rising above the poverty line and becoming high school valedictorian. And thanks to the access from the AT&T program, it can help these dreams turn into realities. That's why we're making a $2 billion 3-year commitment to help close the digital divide so that more Americans have a chance to succeed. To learn more, visit AT&T.com/connecting communities.